In your view, is the OBR independent or not?
Well, I think there are serious questions about both its independence and about its credibility. And I think the problem is that the Tories have done a pretty good job at strangling what could have been a good idea at its very birth. I do think it needs to be more independent, but I think Sir Alan's evidence today does raise another question. He said that it was misleading to use the figures they published just before Prime Minister's question time, comparing what we would have done with the Tories' budget, and yet that is precisely what David Cameron did. Now, I can't believe that David Cameron wasn't told by his advisers before he came to the House of Commons that to attempt to compare these two figures were grossly misleading. And, you know, only, 8 or 9 weeks into this government, for the Prime Minister to have done that is a pretty serious matter.
Alan Budd says that, indeed he insists, that no pressure was put on him to change the OBR employment predictions. Do you accept that?
I'm not criticising Sir Alan Budd. He's a very decent public servant. I do think, though, the Tories, I think, conceived this whole thing as giving them some sort of respectability to do what they've always wanted to do.
Because it was meant to be independent.
Yes, it was meant to be independent, but you've got the same civil servants producing advice for both the Chancellor and the OBR. There's no clear distinction between the two. I think the real problem is if you're going to have something that's independent, it has to be genuinely independent. Sure. What's happened here is the Tories have been using this not just as an adjunct of government, but almost a part of their own party. And I think that has seriously undermined what I think could have been quite a good idea.
But it has shown a certain independence, because the original line from the new coalition government was, I paraphrase, "We've seen the books and it's worse than we thought." But the OBR predictions in a number of major areas showed actually it's not as bad as we thought. So in that area, the OBR was independent.
Look, I was very careful when I said I'm not criticising Sir Alan Budd or his two colleagues. I think they are decent people trying to do a decent job. And you are right that right from the start, this preposterous claim that things were worse than the Tories thought was rubbished by the OBR. I think the problem is not with Sir Alan Budd, far from it. The problem is that George Osborne has been using this thing almost as a prop for what he wants to do, and that has seriously undermined its independence and its credibility.
Did you ever think of doing this when you were in the Treasury?
Yeah, I did. But, it's like many things, there were good arguments for, but there were plenty of other things to deal with at the time.
Now that it exists, if you were to be asked for your advice, would you recommend that a future Labour government keep it and enhance its independence?
Oh, yes, and there's no going back. It's rather like the independent monetary policy
of the Bank of
committee.
England.
And no one seriously suggests going back to the old days where the Chancellor fixed the rates. What it has to be, though, is it's got to be truly independent. It's got to be accountable to the House of Commons rather than to the Chancellor, and that means that they should be able to say yea or nay to any appointment.
Something called the Congressional Budget Office?
Well, it's similar, except the Constitution in America is rather different.
But it's responsible to the Congress. The clue is in the name.
Whereas, here it is the executive, the government that proposes budgetary measures. But I think that it really has been the worst possible start to this whole idea, and for that, I'm afraid it's the Conservatives. And I really think, coming back to my earlier point, for the Prime Minister to have used these figures to try and compare what he was doing in a more favourable light, that, I think, is really pretty serious.
Would you take it out, given you said it's here to stay, there's no going back, would you take it out of the Treasury, give it its own office, separate from the Treasury, its own building?
Well, I can't see how you'd ever get round the credibility problem or the independence problem if it's just down the door from the Chancellor's office. And with the best will in the world, even if people walked by in the corridor and didn't speak to each other, I don't think anyone would believe it.
All right.